Sometimes fate begins with a mistake, or a kiss meant to save a stranger. The rain fell hard against the dark hills outside Blackthorn Estate, turning the gravel road into a ribbon of mud and silver reflections. Sarah Whitmore pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she walked the long path behind the resort, her tired shoes sinking slightly into the wet ground with every step. It was nearly midnight. She had just finished a 12-hour shift cleaning rooms that cost more per night than she earned in a month. Her back ached, her hands smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and all she could think about was getting home to her small apartment across town, where her 6-year-old son Ethan was asleep on the couch under a blanket she had sewn herself. Being a single mother meant there was no room for rest, no room for mistakes, only the constant quiet pressure of surviving another day. The storm above the mountains rumbled again, low and distant, and lightning flashed briefly across the trees lining the old forest road. Most of the staff avoided this path at night. Guests said the land behind the estate belonged to an ancient family that had owned the valley long before the town existed. People whispered about the name connected to the land. Lucien Voss. Some claimed he was a billionaire who never appeared in public. Others said he was something far older, something that had ruled the night long before electric lights and highways. Sarah didn't believe in rumors. She believed in rent payments and grocery bills. She believed in the small drawing Ethan had taped to their fridge that read, "Best Mom Ever," in crooked crayon letters. But halfway down the narrow trail, she heard something that made her stop. A sound. Soft. Like someone collapsing against wet leaves. Her heart skipped. "Hello," she called cautiously into the dark. No answer. Only rain dripping from the branches above. Sarah hesitated. Walking away would have been easier. Safer. But kindness had always been her weakness. She stepped off the path and pushed through the trees until she saw him. A man lay on the ground beneath the twisted branches of an old oak tree, his dark coat soaked with rain, his skin so pale it almost glowed against the shadows. For a moment Sarah thought he might already be gone. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her fingers searched for a pulse at his neck the way a nurse once showed her when Ethan had fainted at school. Nothing. The man's lips were cold. Too still. Panic rose in her chest. She looked around the empty forest road, realizing no one else was coming. "Please don't do this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Desperate, Sarah tilted his head slightly and pressed her mouth to his, trying to push air back into his lungs the only way she knew how. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the impossible began. The wind stopped. Completely. The rain seemed to hang in the air like frozen glass. And beneath Sarah's trembling hands, the stranger's chest moved again. For several seconds Sarah Whitmore did not move. Her hands were still resting lightly against the stranger's chest, as if she was afraid the slightest motion might break whatever fragile miracle had just happened. The forest had fallen into a strange silence. The rain still touched the leaves, but the wind was gone, completely gone, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Beneath her palms, she felt it again. A heartbeat. Slow, heavy, unnatural, but real. Sarah leaned back slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. Okay, that is good," she whispered nervously, her breath fogging in the cold air. "That means you are not gone." The man lying beneath the oak tree did not respond, but his chest rose again with a deeper breath, the movement faint but unmistakable. Sarah studied his face more carefully now that lightning flashed across the sky again. He looked young, maybe early 30s, yet something about him felt older than the mountains surrounding the valley. His features were sharp and strangely perfect, his dark hair damp with rain, his skin pale in a way that seemed almost luminous against the shadows of the forest. He did not look like someone who belonged on a muddy trail outside a resort. He looked like someone carved from marble and placed in a museum. Sarah swallowed hard. "Who are you?" she murmured quietly, though she did not expect an answer. Her first instinct was to call for help, but the forest road behind the estate barely had cell service, and the staff housing was almost half a mile away. She glanced around again, suddenly aware of how alone she was in the dark. Then something strange happened. The man's hand moved. It was slight, barely noticeable, but his fingers twitched as though he were reaching for something in a distant dream. Sarah froze. "Hey, it is okay," she said quickly, leaning closer again. "You are safe. Just breathe." The words sounded strange, even to her ears. Safe. Out here in the middle of a storm with a stranger whose heartbeat felt like distant thunder under her hands? But kindness had always come easier to her than fear. Another slow breath escaped the man's lips, warmer now. Color seemed to return faintly to his face, not much, but enough to soften the ghost-like stillness he had moments ago. Sarah felt relief wash through her chest. "There we go," she said softly. "That is better." But just as she started to stand, a sound rolled through the trees behind her. Engines. Not the old rattling trucks the maintenance crew drove around the property. These engines were quiet, smooth, expensive. Headlights suddenly cut through the forest darkness like white blades of light, illuminating the rain-soaked trail and the oak tree where Sarah knelt beside the stranger. Her stomach dropped. Two long black vehicles glided into the clearing with impossible precision, their doors opening in perfect synchronization. 5 tall figures stepped out, their coats dark and untouched by the storm. They moved with a kind of calm coordination that made Sarah's pulse quicken instantly. One of them approached first. When the light from the headlights struck his face, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. His eyes reflected silver in the night like a wolf's under moonlight. The man's gaze dropped immediately to the stranger lying on the ground. For the first time his controlled expression cracked. Shock flickered across his face. Then he looked at Sarah, not with anger, not even confusion, with something closer to disbelief. His voice came out quiet and sharp. "Tell me exactly what you just did." Sarah Whitmore felt the words land like a sudden shift in gravity. "And she comes with us." For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood what the king meant, but the commander's reaction made it clear that she had heard him correctly. The tall man with silver-reflecting eyes gave a small respectful nod toward Lucien Voss, and then turned his attention back to Sarah. "Miss Whitmore," he said calmly, "please gather your things." Sarah blinked in confusion. "My things are not here," she replied quickly. "I was only walking home from work. My apartment is 15 minutes away, and my son is waiting there." The moment the words left her mouth, the clearing grew quieter again. Lucien's gaze sharpened slightly. "Your son," he repeated. Sarah nodded. "His name is Ethan. He is 6 years old, and he should be asleep by now. I cannot disappear in the middle of the night without him knowing where I am." The king watched her carefully for several seconds, as though measuring every detail of her response. The rain had softened into a gentle mist around them, and the headlights from the vehicles cast long pale beams across the forest floor. Finally Lucien turned his head slightly toward the commander. "We will stop at her residence first," he said. The commander did not question the order. "Of course, my lord." The rest of the group moved immediately to prepare the transport equipment, but Sarah remained standing where she was, still struggling to process what was happening. "I do not understand," she said quietly. "Why do I need to go anywhere with you?" Lucien stepped closer again, though there was no threat in his movement. "Only certainty. Because what happened tonight is not something we can ignore," he replied calmly. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "I only helped someone breathe again. That is all. For a human heart perhaps, that is a simple act of kindness," Lucien said. "For someone like me it is something else entirely." The commander approached with a long dark coat and offered it respectfully to the king, but Lucien waved it aside and kept his attention on Sarah instead. "When your lips touched mine," he continued quietly, "my body responded in a way it has not done in centuries." The men around them remained silent, but Sarah sensed that every one of them was listening carefully. She felt her pulse quicken. "I did not do anything special," she insisted again. Lucien studied her face with calm patience. "That is exactly what makes it extraordinary." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when one of the vehicles behind them powered on with a low, smooth sound. The rear doors opened, and the interior lights revealed a spacious cabin that looked more like a private aircraft than a normal car. The commander gestured politely toward it. "We should leave the forest before the storm grows stronger," he said. Lucien nodded once, and then looked back at Sarah. "You said your home is 15 minutes away." "Yes," she replied cautiously. "Then we will collect your son and continue the conversation somewhere warmer," he said. Sarah hesitated, glancing from the king to the dark vehicles, and then back to the quiet forest behind her. Everything about this night had become impossible to explain. Finally she exhaled slowly. "My son does not like strangers," she warned. A faint trace of amusement touched Lucien's expression. "After tonight, I suspect your son will have many questions for me as well. The black vehicles moved through the rain-soaked streets of the small mountain town with quiet precision, their headlights cutting through the mist like steady beams of pale light. Sarah Whitmore sat in the back seat of the sleek car beside Lucien Voss, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the unfamiliar city passed outside the window. She had never ridden in a vehicle this smooth before. The engine barely made a sound, and the interior felt warmer than any apartment she had lived in during the past 5 years. Across from them, the commander watched the road through the windshield while speaking quietly into a small communication device, giving directions to the other vehicle following behind them. Sarah glanced toward Lucien again. The crimson glow in his eyes had softened now, appearing darker and calmer in the dim cabin light, but there was still something ancient in the way he observed the world around him. "You are very quiet," he said after a moment. Sarah exhaled slowly. "I am trying to understand how my night went from cleaning hotel rooms to riding in a car with someone who says he is a vampire king." Lucien considered this with a thoughtful expression. "That is a reasonable reaction." She gave a small nervous laugh. "My son is going to think I lost my mind when I explain this." The vehicle slowed as they entered a quieter residential street lined with modest apartment buildings and dim porch lights. Sarah leaned forward slightly and pointed toward a small 2-story complex at the corner. "That one," she said. "Building 3. The car eased away. Stop near the sidewalk." Lucien stepped out first, his long dark coat moving gently in the lingering rain, and Sarah followed a moment later. The commander remained near the vehicle, but his attention stayed focused on the surrounding street, as if he were quietly monitoring everything at once. Sarah hurried up the short walkway and unlocked the front door of her apartment with slightly shaking hands. The warm smell of laundry soap and leftover dinner greeted her immediately. The living room light was still on. She stepped inside and whispered softly, "Ethan." The small figure on the couch stirred beneath the blanket and rubbed his eyes. "Mom," he mumbled sleepily. "You are late." "I know, sweetheart," Sarah said gently as she crossed the room. "I am sorry. Something unexpected happened at work." Ethan pushed himself upright and blinked toward the doorway behind her. That is when he noticed the tall stranger standing quietly just outside the apartment entrance. The boy's eyes widened slightly, not with fear, but with curious surprise. "Mom," he said slowly, "who is that man?" Sarah hesitated for a second. "This is Mr. Lucien," she answered carefully. "He helped me tonight, and we need to go with him for a little while." Ethan studied the tall figure with the honest curiosity only a child could have. Lucien stepped forward into the doorway, but remained respectful of the small space. His voice was calm and warm when he spoke. "Hello, Ethan." The boy tilted his head slightly as if trying to understand something invisible in the air around him. Then he said something that made the room fall completely silent. "Mom," Ethan whispered quietly, "why does he smell like the night wind before a storm?" The small apartment grew very quiet after Ethan's question. Sarah Whitmore blinked in surprise and looked down at her son, unsure how to answer something like that. Lucien Voss remained standing near the doorway, his posture calm and composed, yet the faint curiosity in his crimson eyes suggested the child's words had caught his attention as well. Ethan did not look afraid. Instead, he stared at Lucien with the open curiosity that children often had when they sensed something unusual but did not yet understand why. "What do you mean by that?" Lucien asked gently. His voice carried a calm warmth that made the small room feel strangely peaceful despite the storm outside. Ethan shrugged slightly and rubbed one sleepy eye. "I do not know," he said honestly. "It is just how the air feels before a big storm comes. Cool and quiet." Sarah glanced between them, her mind still racing from everything that had happened that night. She placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Sweetheart, Mr. Lucien is going to help us with something important tonight. We just need to take a short trip with him." Ethan looked up at her. "Are we in trouble?" "No," Sarah answered quickly. "Not at all." The boy seemed satisfied with that explanation and slid off the couch, pulling his blanket around his shoulders like a cape. "Okay," he said simply. "Where are we going?" Lucien stepped a little farther into the room, but remained respectful of the modest space. "Somewhere safe and quiet where we can talk," he replied calmly. Ethan studied him again with that same thoughtful expression. "You talk funny," he observed. "Not bad funny, just different." Lucien gave a faint smile that carried a trace of something older than humor. "I have had a long time to practice speaking carefully." Sarah moved quickly through the small apartment, gathering the few things they would need for the night. She packed Ethan's backpack with a change of clothes and his favorite book while her mind tried to keep up with the impossible turn her life had taken. Only 2 hours earlier, she had been pushing a cleaning cart down a hotel hallway thinking about grocery bills and tomorrow's shift. Now a centuries-old king stood quietly in her living room, speaking gently to her son. Ethan zipped his jacket and walked back toward the door where Lucien waited. The boy paused for a moment and tilted his head again as if listening to something far away. The rain outside had almost stopped now, leaving only a soft whisper against the windows. "Mom," Ethan said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart. When Mr. Lucien looked at you earlier, it felt like when the sky changes colors before sunrise." Sarah frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan shrugged again with the simple honesty only a child could manage. "Like something big is about to happen and nobody knows it yet." Lucien's eyes shifted slowly towards Sarah Whitmore after hearing that. The ancient calm in his expression did not change, but the weight of his gaze felt different now, as if the child's words had quietly confirmed something he had already begun to suspect about the night fate had brought them together. The rain had stopped completely by the time Sarah Whitmore locked the apartment door behind them. The night air outside felt cooler now, fresh and quiet, as if the storm had washed the entire town clean. Ethan held his small backpack with both hands while standing beside his mother on the narrow walkway. The black vehicle waited at the curb like a silent shadow beneath the streetlight. When Lucien Voss stepped toward it, the driver opened the door without a word. Sarah hesitated for a moment before following. Something about leaving her small apartment in the middle of the night with strangers still felt unreal. Yet the calm certainty in Lucien's presence made the decision easier than she expected. Ethan climbed into the seat beside her and pressed his face lightly against the window, watching the quiet neighborhood as the vehicle began moving again. The town looked different at this hour. Empty streets, closed shops, porch lights glowing softly in the dark. After several minutes, Ethan turned toward Lucien again with the same thoughtful curiosity he had shown earlier. "Mr. Lucien," he asked, "do you live in a castle?" Sarah blinked in surprise at the question, but Lucien answered calmly. "Yes," he said, "something like that." Ethan's eyes widened slightly with quiet excitement. "I have never been inside a castle before." Sarah gave a small tired laugh. "Neither have I." The vehicle moved smoothly out of town and onto a long mountain road that curved through the dark forest. The trees rose high on both sides, their branches forming a shadowed tunnel above the pavement. Sarah watched the passing landscape through the window, trying to understand what her life might look like when morning arrived. Everything had changed so quickly that it still felt like part of a dream. Lucien remained silent for most of the drive, his gaze focused on the distant road ahead. But after a while he finally spoke again. "Sarah Whitmore," he said quietly. She turned toward him. "Yes. When you found me tonight, you said something important." Sarah frowned slightly. "I said a lot of things. You said no one deserves to be left alone in the rain." She nodded slowly. "I still believe that." Lucien studied her for a moment before looking toward Ethan, who had begun to drift toward sleep against the seat beside her. "That belief may be the reason the world changed tonight," he said softly. Sarah looked at him with uncertainty. "I do not understand what you mean." Lucien's crimson eyes reflected faintly in the dim cabin light as the vehicle climbed higher into the mountains. "There are forces older than kingdoms and empires that shape the paths of certain lives," he explained. "Sometimes those paths cross in ways no one expects." The road curved sharply and the forest suddenly opened into a wide clearing high above the valley. Ahead of them, rising from the edge of a rocky cliff, stood a massive stone citadel illuminated by golden lights against the dark sky. Ethan lifted his head sleepily and whispered with quiet wonder, "Mom, is that the castle?" Sarah stared at the towering structure in disbelief. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "I think it is." The vehicle slowed as the massive gates began to open. Lucien looked toward Sarah one more time, his expression calm but filled with ancient certainty. Tonight was only the beginning.